The biting autumn wind, fresh off the Caucasus Range, snapped the red banner above the dockmaster's office, carrying the smell of brine, diesel, and decaying fish into the industrial district. Down on the damp, oil-stained pier, the morning bustle was already in full swing. Black Sea Fleet patrol boats bobbed gently beside sturdy fishing trawlers, their hulls painted the drab Soviet gray-green. A cluster of sailors, their heavy pea coats buttoned high against the chill, were gathered near the water's edge, not for official duty, but for a private, early morning spectacle. They weren't looking at the sleek lines of a new submarine or the arrival of a prized catch. They were looking at Georgian Rukulishvili. Georgian, a local fisherman known for his quiet intensity and hands hardened by 2 decades on the water, was struggling. He was wrestling something large, round, and distinctly non-maritime onto the deck of his small, humble fishing boat, the Dolphin. The object was a barrel, not a standard wooden cask for storing salted herring, but a monstrous, custom-built metallic cylinder, easily 5 feet in diameter and standing almost as tall. Its surface was polished aluminum, sealed with thick, black caulking, and secured with heavy-duty steel bands. It looked less like a vessel and more like a massive, silvery seed. "Look at the professor," snickered Senior Lieutenant Vronsky, a young, impeccably uniformed officer assigned to the Coastal Defense Watch. He adjusted his fur hat, a plume of breath escaping his lips. "He's built himself a new house. A floating house." A grizzled, older petty officer, Mikhail, spat onto the pier, the sound cutting through the air. "It's a joke, Lieutenant. The man's gone mad. Says he's going to find the great catch with that thing. A steel coffin is what it is." Georgian ignored them. His face, etched with deep lines from years of sun and sea, was set in an expression of absolute focus. His worn, leather gloves gripped the heavy rope as he meticulously secured the barrel to the boat's mast, testing the knots with a powerful tug. This barrel was the culmination of 6 months of secret work, a project conducted in a secluded shed miles outside Poti, fueled by hoarded materials and sheer, stubborn will. He designed it to be watertight, practically unsinkable, and, most importantly, invisible to casual inspection, assuming it was just another piece of industrial equipment. Inside the barrel, a meager but crucial stockpile was already secured. 20 pounds of dried black bread, several blocks of salo, salted pork fat, a 3-liter flask of fresh water, a compass jury rig from a toy, a small fishing hook and line, and, most critical of all, a stack of heavily oiled, laminated maps of the Black Sea and the Turkish coast. Georgian's movements were economical and precise. He was not preparing for a fishing trip. He was preparing for a transit, a one-way, unauthorized, and utterly desperate journey across a body of water patrolled by one of the most efficient naval forces in the world, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. He was gambling his life against the immense, crushing military apparatus of the Cold War, staking everything on a barrel and the unpredictable currents of the sea. As the sun crept higher, illuminating the Georgian mountains in a pale gold, Georgian finished his preparations. He stepped off his boat and walked toward a small supply shed. He needed one last, critical piece of equipment, a small, silent kerosene lamp to provide light inside his dark capsule. The sailors continued their mocking. He should just sail to Batumi and ask for a transfer. Another sailor jested, referring to the nearby port city. The Turks will think he's a new type of mine. This disregard, this dismissal of his creation as an old man's folly, was precisely what Georgian counted on. He knew the Soviet system bred conformity, and anything that deviated this radically from the norm would be written off as harmless lunacy. No one would suspect that the eccentric fisherman was building an escape pod. He returned from the shed, securing the small lamp, and then turned to the small crowd of onlookers. His eyes were steady and devoid of anger, or even fear. He just looked determined. "A good day for the currents," Georgian said, his voice low and gravelly, the first words he'd spoken all morning. "They favor the west today." He climbed back onto the Dolphin, started the small diesel engine with a practiced hand, and slowly began to motor away from the crowded pier, the immense aluminum barrel bobbing awkwardly behind him. He steered a course that appeared to be the standard one, out past the main breakwater, toward the open sea where the best fishing grounds lay. But today, the fishing wasn't his goal. The sailors laughed, waving sarcastic farewells. "Bring back a dolphin for the lieutenant," they shouted. The lieutenant chuckled, turning away from the pier. "Madman, file a report under eccentric fisherman." Georgian didn't look back. The engine of the dolphin hummed, the sound a low drone swallowed quickly by the vastness of the sea. He knew he had a few hours of grace, maybe until the evening patrol noticed his late return. He had to be miles away, submerged and silent by then. By the way, if you're watching this video, drop a comment below with the time and place you're watching from. I'd love to know where this story is traveling. His plan was audacious, simple, and utterly dependent on two forces: the relentless, unforgiving nature of the Black Sea and the arrogance of the Soviet border guards. He had to shed the dolphin, board the barrel, and then commit himself to the currents. 1,000 miles of open, freezing water lay between him and freedom. Georgian steered the dolphin due west for almost 4 hours, pushing the small engine hard against the growing swells. By noon, the low-slung, forested coastline of Soviet Georgia had faded into a faint, hazy blue line on the horizon. He was now approximately 50 miles offshore, deep within the international waters frequently traversed by Soviet naval patrols, yet distant enough from the coastline to avoid the immediate scrutiny of the shore-based radar and coastal watchtowers. This was the point of no return. The sea, a restless, cold expanse of slate gray, was cooperating, at least initially. The wind was a steady northeasterly, which, combined with the dominant Black Sea surface current, the main current system flows counterclockwise, meant a consistent push toward the Turkish coast to the south and west. This natural engine was Georgian's primary fuel. He slowed the dolphin to a drift, letting the waves rock the small boat. The oversized aluminum barrel, tethered securely, knocked heavily against the hull with a deep, metallic thud that resonated through the fiberglass. Georgian went about the grim business of preparing his escape capsule for deployment. First, he transferred the last of the vital supplies from the dolphin. This included a heavy, wool greatcoat he'd reserved for the purpose, which he folded meticulously inside the barrel, hoping its thickness would insulate him against the inevitable drop in temperature. He also retrieved a pair of crude, handmade wooden paddles. They weren't for serious propulsion, but for small, necessary directional adjustments once he was committed to the currents. Next came the transfer of the most important cargo, himself. The barrel was designed with a hinged, circular hatch on its top, reinforced with a heavy-duty rubber gasket and a series of screw clamps. Georgian climbed onto the dolphin's small stern deck, carefully lowered himself into the open hatch, and dropped inside. The interior was cramped, dark, and smelled powerfully of metal, sealant, and recycled air. It was a space barely large enough for a man to sit with his knees drawn up. He was now sealed within his private world, a metallic shell separating him from the vast, freezing ocean. He paused for a moment, letting the darkness swallow him, adjusting his eyes. The kerosene lamp, once lit, would be his only source of warmth and light, but he wouldn't risk lighting it until he was well away from the dolphin. The most difficult and riskiest part of the operation remained. He had to sever the connection to his old life, the boat that had been his livelihood for decades. Georgian maneuvered himself out of the barrel, a tricky process in the pitching sea, and stood again on the deck of the dolphin. The small fishing boat was now nothing more than a liability, a floating piece of evidence that would immediately trigger a search by the Soviet border guards, the KGB's maritime border troops. He pulled a heavy, serrated survival knife from his belt. He had to scuttle the dolphin quickly and cleanly. He plunged the knife repeatedly into the hull near the waterline, driving it deep into the fiberglass and wood composite. The sound of the tearing material was sickeningly loud. Water immediately began to seep, then stream into the bilge. He did the same on the opposite side, ensuring the sinking would be swift and balanced. The dolphin began to settle noticeably lower in the water. Finally, he stood by the mast and cut the thick tether connecting the dolphin to his aluminum barrel. The moment of separation. The barrel, now free, drifted a short distance away, carried by the first serious swell. Georgian watched it go, then scrambled quickly back onto the sinking boat. His goal was to get onto the barrel and seal the hatch before the dolphin went down completely, a maneuver requiring delicate timing in the choppy water. He waited until the dolphin listed heavily, her engine block filling rapidly with seawater. As she dipped her bow into a large wave, Georgian took a tremendous leap, a desperate, all-or-nothing move, launching himself across the turbulent gap of water and onto the top of the floating barrel. He landed hard, the impact jarring his teeth, but he clung to the metallic rim. The barrel rotated wildly in the waves, a disconcerting, dizzying motion. He forced his body to remain calm, opened the hatch, and dropped inside one final time. Below him, the dolphin was making her final descent. A gurgling, sucking sound, the death rattle of the fishing vessel, echoed across the water. The boat's stern rose briefly, exposing the propeller to the air, before she slid beneath the waves, leaving behind only a patch of swirling foam and a widening slick of diesel fuel. Georgian immediately began wrenching the heavy screw clamps tight, securing the round hatch against the tremendous pressure of the sea. 10 clamps, each requiring immense force to fully seal, a physical exertion that left him shaking. The moment he tightened the last one, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sloshing sound of the small amount of bilge water he had deliberately kept inside the barrel for stability. He was now alone, trapped, sealed, and drifting. His entire world was reduced to the cramped, dark interior of the barrel. Outside, the sea was erasing all evidence of the dolphin, and with it, all evidence of Georgian Rakulishvili's escape. The Cold War's deadliest border lay ahead, and he was nothing more than a rumor of an eccentric fisherman floating in an aluminum can. The countdown had begun. The initial hours inside the barrel were a suffocating trial of the senses. The constant, rhythmic violence of the sea became Georgian's reality. He was battered by the sounds, the enormous, echoing clang of the waves against the aluminum hull, the ceaseless slosh of water inside the bilge, and a high-pitched, terrifying groan as the metal expanded and contracted with the pressure and cold. The darkness was absolute, a velvety black that pressed against his eyeballs, leaving him disoriented and fighting a primal panic. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhalation and exhalation, anchoring himself with the knowledge that this sensory deprivation was, paradoxically, his greatest defense. He had to remain invisible. Georgian finally risked lighting the small kerosene lamp. The resulting light was weak, casting dancing, flickering shadows on the curved walls, but it was enough to reassert his control over the tiny space. He checked his makeshift instruments. The cheap compass, glued to a piece of driftwood, spun wildly with the motion of the waves, but generally confirmed the desired heading, west-southwest. The small barometer, pilfered from a weather station, was dropping, a warning of worsening weather ahead. The clock in Poti was nearing 6 p.m. This was the critical window. Georgian knew the dockmaster recorded the expected return times of all local vessels. The Dolphin was now officially overdue. At the Poti Harbor Master's office, the delayed filing of the missing Dolphin was initially met with bureaucratic indifference. Petty Officer Nikolai, a man whose career was defined by strict adherence to routine, noted the absence, but assumed a mechanical issue or a late run. It wasn't until 8 p.m., when a fishing rival of Georgian's complained that the Dolphin was occupying a lucrative spot, that the alarm was finally, reluctantly, raised. The information was routed up the chain of command, landing eventually on the desk of Captain Vasily Zhukov of the Maritime Border Troops, stationed near Batumi. Zhukov was a veteran KGB officer, efficient and acutely aware of the stakes of any unauthorized movement across the Black Sea. To the Soviets, the sea was not a natural border, but a controlled, secure frontier, a watery section of the Iron Curtain. Any potential escapee was not just a defector, but a security breach. Zhukov did not waste time. He ordered an immediate Level 2 alert, a full aerial and maritime search pattern deployed within a 100-mile radius of Poti. Back inside his barrel, Georgian felt the first serious shift in the sea's temperament. The surface currents, which had been gently carrying him, gave way to larger, choppier waves. The barrel began to rotate with greater speed and violence, tossing him around the confined space like a pebble in a tumbler. He gripped the internal frame he had welded into place, his knuckles white with effort. He focused on the only thing he could control, stabilizing the meager bilge water to reduce the rocking and keeping the kerosene lamp from tipping. At 11 p.m., the sound he dreaded finally cut through the ocean noise, the low, throbbing drone of a heavy engine. It was too sustained and too powerful to be a merchant ship. It was a Soviet naval vessel. Georgian immediately extinguished the kerosene lamp, plunging himself back into total, oppressive darkness. He flattened himself against the cold metal floor, heart hammering against his ribs. He could taste the metallic tang of fear and the oiliness of the residual diesel. The patrol boat, likely a Stenka-class border patrol cutter, was moving slowly, executing a precise search grid. Its powerful engine noise grew louder, closer, until it was directly overhead, a terrifying, all-encompassing vibration that felt like it was rattling the very air out of his lungs. Georgian imagined the sailors on deck, their powerful searchlights sweeping the water. The barrel, being largely submerged and presenting a minimal profile, was his only shield. Its aluminum construction, he hoped, was too small and too non-ferrous to register clearly as anything other than sea clutter on the patrol boat's basic radar. The cutter paused. The engine noise dropped to a low, ominous idle. Georgian knew the boat was probably looking for floating debris, the debris of a dolphin. The crew would be scanning the slick of diesel fuel that would still be on the surface, marking the spot where the boat went down. He held his breath. A new, unnerving sound reached him, the ping of an active sonar system. The Soviet vessel was sweeping for anything large or metallic beneath the waves. The pinging was close, mechanical, and insistent. Ping, ping, ping. The sonar beam passed directly over him. He felt the cold, electric resonance of the sound waves vibrating through the barrel's metal skin and into his body. The barrel, being a simple, non-ballistic shape, reflected the sound waves back chaotically, hopefully appearing to the operator as nothing more than a deep-sea eddy or a discarded, large piece of metal. It was a tense, agonizing 5 minutes. Then, slowly, the engine noise picked up again. The thrumming sound receded, becoming fainter, moving away toward the northeast, continuing the search. They hadn't found the boat debris yet, or perhaps they had found it and filed the dolphin as simply lost at sea, the fisherman presumed drowned. Either way, the immediate danger had passed. Georgian did not move for another hour, waiting until the engine sound was completely gone, swallowed by the waves and the wind. He was soaked in sweat and trembling from the intense fear, but he was alive, and more importantly, he was still moving west. He had survived the first, deadliest check of the Cold War machine. The sea had hidden him. Now he had to survive the sea itself. The first full night was an ordeal that tested Georgian's physical and mental fortitude to their breaking point. The barometer's warning proved accurate. A minor gale swept across the central Black Sea, turning the deep water into a chaotic, unforgiving environment. The aluminum barrel, designed for buoyancy and concealment, now proved to be an efficient conductor of the ocean's brutality. Waves, some cresting 6 to 8 feet, battered the vessel. Georgian estimated the barrel was fully submerged nearly half the time, only to burst back to the surface, shedding water with a violent shudder. The constant pitching, rolling, and spinning induced immediate, debilitating seasickness. The confined space offered no reprieve. He could only brace himself, curl into a fetal position, and endure the stomach-churning gyration. The cold was relentless. Despite his wool coat and the heavy metal shell, the Black Sea's November temperature, hovering barely above freezing, leached the warmth from his body. Every metal surface was coated in a clammy layer of condensation. His breath plumed out in the darkness. The small kerosene lamp, which he lit sparingly for a few minutes every hour, was useless against the thermal onslaught. His hands and feet were rapidly losing sensation, becoming heavy, inert blocks of ice. He knew the danger was not just drowning or exposure, but hypothermia. To combat the cold, he forced himself into a regimented routine of isometric exercises, tense and releasing muscles in his arms and legs, a desperate effort to keep the blood circulating. The second morning, day 2 of the voyage, brought a temporary calm. Georgian risked cracking open the hatch for a few precious seconds, allowing a rush of crisp, cold air to enter and clear the stagnant, heavy atmosphere. He quickly closed it, but the fleeting glimpse of the sun, a pale disk peeking through the clouds, was a profound psychological boost. He took his first inventory of supplies. The bread was slightly damp, but salvageable. The salo remained solid. The water flask was still half full. He rationed himself immediately. A thumb-sized piece of bread and a sliver of fat, twice a day, and 3 sips of water. The journey was measured not in miles, but in calories. The worst psychological enemy was the noise and the isolation. The continuous metallic drumming and sloshing was a form of auditory torture, making sleep impossible beyond brief, fitful nods. The silence of the Soviet state was replaced by the terrifying, deafening roar of nature. Georgian had to fight the urge to shout, to break the silence and the monotony, knowing any noise could be carried by the wind and expose him. He used his primitive compass and his laminated maps. His maps, drawn from memory and old fishing charts, were his only connection to the outside world. He calculated his rough drift velocity based on the current charts he had studied for months. He estimated he was traveling at approximately 1 to 1.5 knots, a glacial pace. If the currents held, he projected he could reach the Turkish territorial waters near the Sinop Peninsula in 7 to 10 days. 7 to 10 days in this metal coffin. Midday on day 2 brought another encounter. This time, not a naval cutter, but a massive Soviet tanker, likely en route for Novorossiysk. The ship was enormous, a black, rust-streaked behemoth that cast a shadow over the barrel. Georgian heard it before he saw it, a deep, earth-shaking thump-thump-thump as the ship's propellers drove through the water. The sheer scale of the vessel was terrifying. If the tanker passed too close, the powerful wake and propeller turbulence could easily capsize or crush the small barrel. He heard the voices of the crew, faintly, echoing from the ship's superstructure. They were close enough for him to distinguish the rough, rolling tones of Russian commands. The barrel was bobbing in the wash of the tanker's hull. Georgian held himself rigid, praying for the anonymity of clutter, hoping they wouldn't spot the tiny, unusual metallic object in the expanse of gray. The tanker passed. The resulting turbulence was violent, throwing the barrel end over end, slamming Georgian's head painfully against the wall. But the ship was focused on its destination, its massive bulk ignoring the speck of life it had almost destroyed. The passage of the tanker served as a grim reminder. The Black Sea was a highway of Soviet military and commercial power. Every vessel was a potential threat, and every day brought a renewed risk of discovery. As the second night fell, bringing with it renewed wind and wave action, Georgian retrieved his fishing line. It was a psychological act, as much as a practical one. In his old life, fishing was persistence, a quiet conversation with the sea. Now he lowered the line through a tiny, pre-drilled and gasket-sealed hole near the bilge. He baited the small hook with a shred of salo. He knew the chances were infinitesimal, but the act of trying to provide for himself, of asserting his will against the hopelessness, was essential for survival. He sat in the dark, the cold seeping into his bones, listening to the cacophony of the sea, patiently holding the line. He was no longer a fisherman. He was a relic of Soviet descent, a man reduced to the size of his ambition, adrift in a metallic barrel, waiting for a bite that might never come, and for a foreign shore that felt impossibly far away. The third and fourth days marked the true inflection point of the journey. Gurum's body began its slow, painful process of adjustment. The crippling seasickness subsided, replaced by a constant, dull ache in every muscle and bone. The cold remained his primary adversary, forcing him to keep a rigorous, almost meditative focus on his internal movements to generate what little heat he could. He was conserving energy, entering a state of enforced hibernation, waiting for the sea to do its work. On the morning of day 4, Gurum noticed a significant change in the barrel's motion. The chaotic, localized tossing had been replaced by a smoother, more powerful sense of forward momentum. He risked a careful, partial crack of the hatch, allowing his eyes to adjust to the light. The sea was still rough, but the pattern of the waves suggested a deeper, stronger pull. He had entered the Black Sea Rim current. This massive, continuous counterclockwise current system flows powerfully along the edges of the sea and was the very backbone of his escape plan. He had aimed for this stream, knowing it would provide the fastest, most reliable transit toward the southwest. The current was pushing him now with an undeniable force. His rate of drift increased, and his spirits, severely depressed by the previous day's struggle, lifted slightly. He was now truly moving. He consulted his compass and maps again. The calculations confirmed his location. He was now roughly halfway across the main expanse of the sea, somewhere southwest of the Crimean Peninsula, and well on a track that would intersect the Turkish economic zone. This geographical location was simultaneously a source of hope and a massive new danger. The Turkish coast, an alien world across the ideological divide, was only a few days away by this accelerated current. But this zone was also the main international shipping lane, meaning high traffic from Soviet, Bulgarian, Romanian, and Turkish vessels, and crucially NATO patrols. While he sought freedom in the West, being found by a Turkish naval vessel deep in the Black Sea was equally risky. They might report the discovery, or worse, turn him over to the Soviets for political gain or adherence to maritime protocols. The monotony of the barrel became its own distinct psychological torture. Gurum began to create routines to preserve his sanity. He would spend hours meticulously checking the sealed hatch for any signs of leakage, cleaning the residual oil from the kerosene lamp, and, perhaps most importantly, reciting poetry and songs from his native Georgia. He found himself remembering the intricate lyrics of old folk songs, the stories of ancient kings and heroes, a mental anchor to the culture and identity the Soviet system had tried to homogenize and control. On day 5, his persistence with the fishing line finally paid a small dividend. After feeling a subtle, tentative tug, he slowly, painstakingly hauled the thin line up. Attached to the small hook was a single, small sprat, barely 4 inches long. It was a meager catch, yet it felt like a triumph of biblical proportions. The tiny fish, quickly and gratefully consumed raw, provided a crucial injection of protein and fat, helping to replenish the severely depleted caloric reserves of his body. It was proof that he was still a fisherman, capable of survival even in this metallic cell. But the good fortune was short-lived. That evening, the weather turned hostile once more. A squall, a rapid onset, violent storm characteristic of the Black Sea in autumn, descended upon him. The barrel was buffeted by wind gusts Gurum estimated to be over 50 knots. The waves were not just battering the sides. They were overwhelming the vessel. For the first time, Gurum felt the deep, cold fear that he might not survive the sea itself. The waves hammered the hatch, and a tiny, insidious stream of water began to seep through the rubber gasket. It was a slow, steady drip, but it meant a potential breach. The rising water level inside, combined with the bilge water, was threatening to upset the barrel's delicate stability, turning it from a secure capsule into a rolling, heavy drum. Panicked, Gurum scrambled for the caulking he had brought, a thick, tar-like sealant reserved for precisely this kind of emergency. Working in the pitch dark, with the barrel rocking violently and the constant sound of the storm roaring outside, he had to reach the inside perimeter of the hatch and press the sealant into the narrow gap where the water was coming in. It was a frantic, desperate battle fought with numb fingers and failing strength. After nearly an hour of grueling work, he managed to seal the breach. The dripping stopped. He had won a temporary victory against the sea, but the encounter had cost him valuable energy, and the constant soaking had exacerbated his exposure to the cold. As day 6 dawned, Georgian was exhausted, dehydrated, and suffering the initial signs of delirium. He was losing track of time, and the lines between his memory, his hopes, and his terrifying reality began to blur. He knew he was nearing the target, but the hardest, most exposed portion of the journey, the final run into Turkish waters, where surveillance would be highest, was still ahead. His mind turned to the only thing keeping him going, the image of a foreign coastline, a sanctuary, and the sound of a language that wasn't Russian, promising a life outside the Iron Curtain's reach. Days 6 and 7 were defined by a desperate, twofold battle, against his own body's collapse and against the increasing maritime traffic. Georgian's extreme rationing, now down to a few crumbs of bread and 1 sip of water per meal, was taking a severe toll. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen. He was constantly shivering, and the rhythmic sound of the waves inside the barrel now seemed to merge with the sound of his own pulse, a constant, dull thrumming. He was entering the physiological state of a man running on pure, terrified adrenaline and stubborn will. He knew that even if he survived the cold and starvation, his chance of being spotted increased exponentially the closer he got to the coast. The Anatolian coastline ahead was monitored by the Turkish Navy, a NATO ally, meaning their patrols were frequent, professional, and equipped with superior search technology. On the afternoon of day 7, Georgian risked a prolonged check of his environment. He unscrewed the hatch just enough to peer out through the narrow gap, keeping his face low to the water. What he saw shocked him back to alertness. The water had changed color. No longer the deep indigo of the open sea, but a lighter, greener hue, indicative of a shallower continental shelf. More immediately, the air was thicker, carrying the scent of pine and soil. He was close. He could faintly make out the high, dark outline of a coastline through the haze, the mountains above the Turkish port of Trabzon. He estimated he was within 50 nautical miles of Turkish territorial waters. The sea traffic was intense. A massive containerized freighter, flying a Liberian flag, passed within a mile of the barrel, its horn booming a low, mournful call. Then, a smaller, fast-moving vessel appeared on the horizon. It was low to the water, painted a battleship gray, and moving with an unmistakable purpose, a patrol boat. Georgian slammed the hatch shut and secured it with frantic haste. He plunged back into the dark silence. This was the moment his whole plan was designed for, the ultimate test of the barrel's ability to disappear. He heard the patrol boat's engine change pitch, a sign it was slowing or altering course. He imagined the officers on the bridge, scanning the sea with binoculars and radar. He knew that near the coast, any unusual metallic signature would be immediately flagged, regardless of size. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He waited for the telltale rush of the vessel directly overhead, the loud, decisive sound of a motor stopping, or worse, the sound of a gunnel scraping against his hull. Instead, he heard a sudden, violent thump against the side of the barrel. It was not the hull of the patrol boat, but something large and organic. He heard a powerful snort and the rush of expelled air, immediately followed by another heavy impact. A dolphin. He had been struck by a member of the pods that frequently hunt near the Turkish shelf. The noise was terrifying, but it was also a blessing. The erratic movement and the sound generated by the marine life likely appeared on the patrol boat systems as nothing more than a pod of cetaceans, a common sight that would be filtered out as non-hostile noise. The patrol boat sped past, its engine noise fading into the distance. The incident, while terrifying, had provided the perfect natural camouflage. Georgian realized he couldn't simply drift onto the Turkish shore. If he washed up on a remote beach, he risked being found by a civilian, or even worse, a local security detachment who might not understand his political defection and simply treat him as a suspicious foreign national. He needed to be found by a high-seas vessel, preferably one flying a non-Soviet flag, to ensure his immediate political safety and rescue. He decided on a course of action. He had to actively navigate the barrel to intercept the shipping lanes running parallel to the Turkish coast. Using his small, wooden paddles, he unsealed the hatch just enough to push the water, aiming to subtly shift the barrel's trajectory. It was exhausting, painfully slow work. His arms, weakened by days of starvation, felt like lead. He could only manage a few powerful strokes before collapsing back into the barrel, panting, the cold air rushing in and out of his lungs. This desperate paddling continued for most of day 8. His vision was blurring. His sense of reality was slipping. He spoke aloud to himself now, not in Georgian songs, but in terse, instructional commands. Paddle. South. Stay awake. Live. Late on day 8, his makeshift map indicated he was directly in the center of the established shipping route, approximately 20 miles off the Turkish coast. He made the final, risky decision. He fully sealed the hatch, secured his body, and prepared to wait for rescue or death. He had nothing left to give. The final outcome was now entirely in the hands of fate, the currents, and the ships of the free world. He extinguished the lamp, closed his eyes, and drifted into a cold, terrifying wait. Day 9 was a nightmare of psychological attrition. Guillaume's physical exhaustion was so profound that the cold no longer registered as a sharp pain, but as a deep, pervasive numbness. He had entered the critical stages of starvation and dehydration. The walls of the aluminum barrel seemed to press in on him, the darkness no longer protective but menacing. He began to hallucinate. The ceaseless sloshing of the bilge water transformed into the sound of voices, familiar voices from Poti, calling his name, taunting him about his floating barrel. He could see the shadowy outlines of the Soviet sailors, Vronsky and Mikhail, laughing just outside the hatch. He would lash out, hitting the cold metal, startling himself back to the agonizing silence. The most terrifying hallucination was the sound of the KGB patrol boat returning. He heard the distinct, high-pitched ping of the sonar, closer and more insistent than before, coupled with the heavy, rhythmic drumming of a diesel engine. He spent hours tense, convinced they had found him, convinced the hatch would fly open, and he would be hauled back to the docks of Poti to face the inevitable, terrible consequences of defection. Only the absence of the actual boat confirmed that the noise was entirely internal, a product of his starved, broken mind. Guillaume understood the grave danger of his mental state. He knew that survival hinged on maintaining a razor-thin grip on reality. To combat the delirium, he attempted to focus on tactile sensations. The gritty texture of his wool coat, the cold hardness of the metal floor, the metallic taste of his own dry mouth. He forced himself to review his maps, visualizing the geometry of the sea, the depth contours, and the precise, counterclockwise flow of the current. His final rationing was enacted. He chewed the smallest, driest piece of black bread remaining, allowing it to dissolve slowly on his tongue to maximize the minimal moisture and nutrients. He held the last 3 sips of water in reserve, an absolute final resort. Mid-morning brought the most significant event of the day, a prolonged period of deep fog. The fog was thick and silent, characteristic of the collision of cold air and the relatively warm Black Sea water. While it reduced visibility for any passing ships, a potential lifeline, it also shielded him from the eyes of any accidental search vessels or patrols. He risked opening the hatch again, just a crack. The air that rushed and was thick with moisture and cold, but it carried a promise, the low, mournful moo of a ship's foghorn. It was close, dangerously close, muffled and distorted by the dense fog. Guillaume fumbled for the small wooden paddles. If he was this close, he had to try to influence his position, to ensure he was directly in the path of the unseen vessel. With a surge of adrenaline, he thrust the paddles out and began to churn the water silently, desperately, pushing the barrel a few feet at a time in what he hoped was the direct trajectory of the sound. His arms were screaming with exhaustion, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, but he continued, driven by the knowledge that this was likely his last opportunity. The foghorn sounded again, much closer this time, accompanied by the deep, churning sound of a ship's screws. The vessel was massive, a large merchant ship, likely running its engines slow through the low visibility. Georgian used the last of his strength, paddling until the barrel was directly in the path of the sound. He then collapsed back inside, sealing the hatch just as the ship's enormous bow wave hit the barrel, rocking it violently. The ship passed within yards. Georgian could hear the rush of the water along its steel hull, the loud, grinding sound of its engines, and even the faint, unintelligible sound of activity on its deck. He was so close he could smell the heavy, oily scent of the ship's exhaust. He waited for a change in the sound, a deceleration, an alarm, a sign that he had been seen. Nothing. The ship continued its steady, plodding journey through the fog, oblivious to the man in the barrel it had nearly capsized. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over him. He had been in the path, had been heard, but was too small, too low in the water, too invisible to be spotted in the fog. He had failed. He drifted through the remainder of day 9 and into the early hours of day 10 in a state of semi-consciousness, suspended between hope and the reality of his imminent death by exposure. He had consumed his last piece of food. He had only the final 3 sips of water remaining. The Cold War was silent in the heart of the Black Sea, but its politics were playing out in a tiny metal vessel where a man was slowly giving up the ghost. Georgian had survived the KGB, the storm, and the ships. Now he was losing the battle against his own biology. He made a final, conscious decision. He would not drink the last sips of water. He would hold them, a final act of refusal, a small, dignified gesture against the crushing finality of the sea. The transition from the absolute darkness of the night to the gray, damp light of day 10 was almost imperceptible inside the barrel. Georgian woke, not with a start, but with a slow, agonizing realization that he was still alive. His limbs felt foreign, heavy, and his mind was a cloudy landscape of half-formed thoughts. He was shivering uncontrollably, a deep, internal tremor that no amount of willpower could halt. He focused on the sound. The violent clanging of the storm was gone. The rhythmic sloshing of the waves was softer, more gentle. The barrel was floating in a relatively calm, steady sea, a sign of the protective effect of the nearby continental shelf. He reached up, his fingers fumbling with the heavy screw clamps of the hatch. The effort was Herculean, a task that normally required simple strength, but now demanded his last reserves of energy. He managed to unseal the hatch enough to push it open a few inches, allowing a rush of cold, fresh air to hit his face. He squinted against the weak morning light. The sight that greeted him was a desolate expanse of water, but there on the distant horizon was the clear, sharp line of the Turkish coastline, defined by its low-lying, dark mountains. He was much closer than he thought, likely less than 15 nautical miles offshore, propelled by the final surge of the Black Sea current. But more important than the coast, on the open sea, was another vessel. It was large, bulkier than a patrol boat, and moving purposefully along the shipping lanes. It was a freighter, an aging vessel with a high superstructure and a hull painted a deep, utilitarian rust red. Georgian raised his binoculars, a small, cheap pair he'd hidden away, and focused with painful intensity. The ship was flying a flag he didn't immediately recognize, but it was certainly not the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. He calculated his distance and trajectory. The current was carrying him slowly, agonizingly, directly toward the ship's path. He knew he had to be seen now. He could not rely on pure chance. He had to attract attention, a suicidal risk he was now compelled to take. Georgian hauled himself halfway out of the hatch, a monumental effort that left him dizzy and gasping. The upper half of his body was now exposed, a small, dark silhouette against the vast canvas of the sea. He had no signaling equipment, no flares, nothing but his voice and his own small vessel. He reached back inside and retrieved the one item he had designated as his final, desperate signal, the aluminum lid of a cooking pot, polished mirror bright. He began to flash the morning sun's light toward the oncoming freighter, creating a tiny, erratic sparkle on the water. He stood there, freezing, swaying with the waves, flashing the signal with all the pathetic urgency of a man clinging to his final minute of life. He watched the freighter grow larger, closer. He could now make out the name painted on the bow, M/V Zonguldak. It was a Turkish-registered cargo vessel. On the bridge of the Zonguldak, Captain Aydin Demir was conducting his morning inspection. The sea was calm, the ship running on autopilot. Aydin, a meticulous man, scanned the horizon with his own binoculars, checking for fishing vessels or debris. That's when he saw it, a tiny, almost insignificant flicker of light on the water, 20 degrees off the starboard bow. He dismissed it instantly, as sun glare off a piece of floating trash. But the flicker repeated, too rhythmic, too distinct for natural reflection. He adjusted his powerful maritime binoculars. "Quartermaster," he barked, his voice sharp with urgency. "Alter course 2 degrees starboard. There is something unusual low in the water." As the Zonguldak altered its massive course, the crew began to gather on the bridge, curious. The dark spot grew larger. Through the binoculars, Captain Aydin could finally distinguish the object, a large, cylindrical, metallic barrel. And then, the unmistakable figure of a man, his arms weakly flashing a signal, half emerged from its top. Aydin grabbed the ship's microphone, his voice cutting across the deck. "Man overboard alarm. Prepare to launch rescue boat. Call the Turkish Coast Guard. We have a survivor. Repeat, we have a man in a floating barrel." Guillaume saw the shift in the freighter's direction. He saw the ship's speed drop dramatically. He saw the figures running onto the deck. He collapsed back into the barrel, his strength utterly gone, but his eyes wide with the knowledge of success. The sound of the freighter's massive engines slowing down was the sweetest, most liberating sound he had ever heard. He did not have to wait long. The rescue boat, a bright orange dinghy manned by 2 Turkish seamen, was deployed with practiced efficiency. It sped across the remaining distance, its wake slicing the calm water. As the dinghy pulled alongside the barrel, Guillaume pushed the hatch open one final time. The first seaman, a young, dark-haired man named Emre, peered down into the dark, cramped space. He saw the skeletal, shivering figure of Guillaume, his eyes open but vacant. "Merhabiye," Emre said, his voice hesitant. "Hello." Guillaume Rakulishvili, the Georgian fisherman who had defied the might of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, the man who had sailed 600 miles in a barrel, looked up at his rescuer. He used his final, conscious effort to reach for the water flask. He raised it to the light, then, instead of drinking, he handed it to Emre. "I am free," Guillaume rasped, his voice a dry whisper. Then, the immense physical and mental strain overwhelmed him, and he collapsed back into the cramped interior of the barrel. He was immediately pulled to safety, the 10-day voyage finally, impossibly, over. The transfer from the aluminum barrel to the Turkish rescue dinghy was executed with urgency and care. Guillaume's body was a study in severe exposure, hypothermic, desiccated, and dangerously weak. His clothing was stiff with salt and cold, and his skin was pale and waxy. He was immediately wrapped in thick blankets, his head supported. The young seaman, Emre, who had first reached him, was stunned by the severity of the deprivation etched on the man's face. 10 days had stripped Guillaume down to the bare essence of his will. The dinghy quickly returned to the massive flank of the M/V Zonguldak. A makeshift stretcher was lowered, and Guillaume was gently hoisted onto the deck of the Turkish freighter. The crew gathered, a mixture of silent awe and confusion on their faces. They looked at the man, then back at the bizarre object floating in the water, the watertight aluminum cylinder, the floating barrel, now bobbing innocently beside the huge ship. Captain Aydin Demir, witnessing the survivor's condition, immediately took command. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but even he had a pause. The man's vessel was undeniably a homemade escape capsule, a relic of desperation. He ordered the ship's medical officer, a man with rudimentary training, to begin warming procedures and administer a slow, measured introduction of fluids and sugars. Gearum was moved to the relative warmth of the ship's infirmary. The aluminum barrel, the star of the whole improbable saga, was not forgotten. Captain Aiden, recognizing its significance as both evidence and an engineering curiosity, ordered it secured. A crane was deployed, and the metallic cylinder was winched onto the deck of the Zongul dock, where it sat, dented and scarred by the sea, an undeniable trophy of defiance. Back on the bridge, Captain Aiden carried out his duty. His first and most important communication was to the Turkish Coast Guard. He reported the location, the nature of the rescue, and the identity of the survivor, based on the documents found secured to Gearum's person inside the barrel. Gearum Rakulishvili, formerly of Poti, Soviet Georgia, was now officially a defector, under the protection of a NATO country. The news traveled quickly through the channels of the Cold War. In Ankara, the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs was immediately alerted. The arrival of a Soviet citizen in such a sensational, impossible manner was a diplomatic flashpoint. Turkey was bound by international maritime law to rescue and provide aid, but Gearum's status as a political defector made the case immediately high profile. They knew the Soviet Union would react swiftly and aggressively. And indeed, in Moscow, the news, albeit initially delayed and fragmented, caused immediate fury within the KGB. The official search for the Dolphin had been quietly downgraded to presumed lost at sea due to lack of evidence. But the discovery of Gearum alive in Turkish custody and the detailed, humiliating description of his vessel was a monumental embarrassment. The image of a Soviet citizen sailing out from under the world's most strictly guarded border in a homemade floating barrel was a propaganda disaster. It mocked the very foundation of Soviet control and the assumed loyalty of its citizens. The official line from the Soviet Foreign Ministry was immediately established. Gearum Rakulishvili was a mentally unstable criminal who had stolen his boat and was now to be returned to the USSR immediately to face charges of theft and illegal crossing of the state border. The KGB began a feverish, internal inquiry to determine how an ordinary fisherman had managed to construct and deploy his escape vehicle under the very noses of the Poti harbor master and the local border troops. The young senior Lieutenant Vronsky and Petty Officer Mikhail, the sailors who had mocked Gearum on the pier, were immediately placed under intense scrutiny. Their casual dismissal of the barrel as eccentric fisherman activity was now a career-ending, potentially freedom-ending, oversight. A formal, strongly worded diplomatic note was dispatched from the Soviet ambassador in Ankara to the Turkish government, demanding Gearum's immediate repatriation. The note cited humanitarian concerns for a confused national and threatened a severe downturn in Soviet-Turkish maritime relations. Gearum, slowly recovering in the infirmary, was unaware of the geopolitical storm he had unleashed. As his consciousness returned, the first thing he asked for was not water, but reassurance. When Captain Aiden, through a crewman who spoke broken German, confirmed that the ship was Turkish and they were in Turkish waters, the fisherman closed his eyes, a single tear running down his cheek. He was safe. His journey had transformed from a personal act of defiance into a public, international incident, a bizarre, aquatic Berlin Wall moment that would reverberate across the diplomatic lines of the Cold War. Gearum Rakulishvili, wrapped in thick blankets aboard the M/V dock, was rapidly becoming the central figure in an unexpected Cold War chess match. The Turkish freighter, having secured both the defector and his makeshift vessel, made port in Samsun, a major harbor on Turkey's northern Black Sea coast. The dock was immediately cordoned off by units of the Turkish gendarmerie and a detachment of plainclothes intelligence officers. The immediate priorities of the Turkish authorities were dual: stabilize the survivor and secure the evidence. Gearum was whisked away to a military hospital, where doctors fought the lingering effects of hypothermia and severe dehydration. His prognosis was guarded, but he was alive. Meanwhile, the aluminum barrel was offloaded and transported to a secure naval base for detailed examination. The Turkish Navy's technical experts were stunned by the object's sheer simplicity and effectiveness, a testament to ingenuity over technology. In Ankara, the political machinery spun into overdrive. The case landed squarely on the desk of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Turkey, a key NATO member, was balancing a precarious relationship with its massive Soviet neighbor. Granting asylum to a defector, particularly one whose escape was so humiliating to the USSR, risked direct retaliation, perhaps sanctions on Turkish shipping, or, worse, military posturing along the land border. However, the international optics were impossible to ignore. Gürüm's story, though not yet public, was rapidly circulating through NATO intelligence channels and foreign embassies. The image of a man seeking freedom in a homemade barrel was powerful propaganda for the Western Bloc. Repatriating him would be an ideological surrender and a betrayal of the principle of asylum. The Soviet ambassador, Viktor Semenov, was relentless. He presented the Turkish Foreign Ministry with the official KGB file, heavily redacted, which painted Gürüm as a known malcontent, a thief who had destroyed state property, the Dolphin, and a person requiring urgent psychiatric care in the USSR. Semenov's demand was simple and unyielding. Return the man and his vessel immediately. The Turkish government employed a tactic common in the Cold War: strategic delay and media leakage. They officially acknowledged the Soviet note, but cited Gürüm's critical medical condition as the primary reason for noncompliance, stating that no interrogation or transfer could occur until he was medically fit to travel. Simultaneously, through controlled leaks to international press agencies, primarily those known for their anti-Soviet stance, the bare bones of the story began to emerge. Soviet fisherman crosses Black Sea in barrel, rescued by Turkish freighter. The narrative immediately captured global headlines. Western newspapers seized upon the tale as an allegory for the inherent human desire for freedom versus the oppressive weight of the Soviet state. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet, meanwhile, was conducting a massive but futile sweep of the search area, now less a rescue mission and more an attempt to salvage any remaining debris from the Dolphin to bolster their narrative that the man was merely lost at sea. The public humiliation, however, was already complete. The term Rkulishvili's barrel began to be whispered among the officers, a new, unofficial term for a catastrophic and highly embarrassing security failure. Gürüm's isolation ended as soon as he was medically stable enough to communicate. Turkish intelligence officers, fluent in Russian and Georgian, began the lengthy and delicate process of debriefing. They confirmed his identity, his political motivations, a profound desire to escape the economic stagnation and the lack of personal freedom under the Soviet system, and the meticulous 6-month planning that went into constructing his vessel. He provided the full timeline: the secretive construction, the mocking farewells at the Poti Pier, the sinking of the Dolphin, the hours spent hiding from the Soviet patrol cutter, and the agonizing final days of starvation and delirium. This testimony, gathered by Turkish intelligence, was a political goldmine. It not only detailed a successful defection, but also provided valuable insight into the laxness of Soviet coastal surveillance, a critical piece of intelligence for NATO. After his initial recovery, Gürüm was moved from a military hospital to a secure, comfortable compound in Ankara. He was no longer just a fisherman. He was a living, breathing symbol of Soviet failure. He was provided with clean clothes, nourishing food, and finally, a moment of profound, simple liberty, a view of the outside world, unconstrained by the walls of the barrel or the borders of the USSR. The Turkish government's final decision came a week after the rescue. Gürüm Rkulishvili would be granted political asylum. The decision was communicated to Moscow in a terse diplomatic note, citing international humanitarian law and the irreversible desire of the individual for freedom. The stage was set for the defector's next chapter, now as a free man thrust into the blinding spotlight of international media. Gürüm Rkulishvili's recovery was swift once he was removed from the punishing environment of the barrel and the sea. The physical healing was a matter of rehydration and nourishment, but his story quickly became a global media sensation, transforming him from a simple Georgian fisherman into an improbable Cold War folk hero. The Turkish government, having secured their diplomatic position, granted carefully controlled access to Western media outlets. Journalists flocked to Ankara, eager to interview the man who had outwitted the KGB's maritime border troops with a piece of homemade plumbing. The narrative was perfect, the common man's struggle against the totalitarian machine, a testament to the irresistible pull of freedom. The first published photographs of Georgian showed a gaunt, but alert man, his eyes clear and possessing an almost serene determination. Crucially, the Turks displayed the barrel itself. The photographs of the battered, salt-caked, 5-foot aluminum cylinder, with its heavy hatch, crude compass, and internal welding, were instantly iconic. They provided visceral, tangible proof of the audacity and suffering of the 10-day voyage. The Soviet Union reacted with a predictable but increasingly desperate propaganda campaign. State-controlled media published articles labeling Georgian as a petty embezzler and a sad, deluded man who was now being exploited by Western intelligence agencies for their anti-Soviet hysteria. They entirely omitted any mention of the barrel, referring only to the stolen fishing boat, lost at sea. This denial only fueled the Western narrative, reinforcing the image of a system too rigid and too fearful to admit to a simple, embarrassing truth. American and European newspapers ran front-page stories. Georgian's journey was compared to classical epics, a modern-day odyssey across the Black Sea. Commentators lauded his engineering ingenuity and his sheer, stubborn will. The narrative served a powerful ideological purpose for NATO. It showed that even in the Soviet heartland, the desire for Western-style liberty was so strong that men would risk certain death to attain it. The floating barrel became a powerful, non-military symbol of containment. While the world focused on the sensational escape, Georgian began the difficult process of building a new life. He was offered various opportunities, including lucrative book deals and speaking engagements, but his desires remained simple: safety and the ability to work. He eventually found a degree of normalcy in Turkey, where his unique skill set, his profound knowledge of the sea, and his mechanical aptitude were valuable. He maintained a quiet dignity throughout the media storm. When asked about his motivation, his answers were often simple and heartfelt, focusing not on ideology, but on the lack of opportunity and the pervasive atmosphere of fear that dominated life in Soviet Georgia. His primary goal, he stated, was to live in a place where he could speak his mind without looking over his shoulder. The story had lasting repercussions within the Soviet system. The KGB investigation into the Poti border guard detachment was exhaustive and brutal. The entire coastal surveillance chain of command was purged. The failure was so spectacular that it led to the immediate implementation of new, stricter protocols for monitoring all private vessels, and a renewed emphasis on ideological vigilance among dockworkers and fishermen. The mockery the sailors had shown Georgian was now cited as a catastrophic example of class enemy infiltration and lax communist discipline. The barrel itself, after being meticulously studied, became a museum piece, eventually displayed in a private collection as a monument to Cold War defiance. It stood as a permanent, silent rebuttal to the Soviet assertion that all its citizens were happy and loyal. Georgian Rakulishvili, the man, faded somewhat from the international headlines, finding the peace and anonymity he truly desired. But the legend of the floating barrel persisted. It entered the vernacular of Cold War history, a bizarre, true story that perfectly encapsulated the high stakes, the low technology, and the ultimate victory of human will over political oppression. It remains a powerful reminder that the desire for freedom is an unstoppable force, capable of crossing any border, even when contained in a 5-foot aluminum can. Georgian's final years in Turkey were marked by a quiet gratitude for the safety and liberty he had risked everything to achieve. He never returned to Georgia, remaining a potent symbol of dissent even decades after his escape. For the Soviet Union, the incident remained a sensitive subject, never officially acknowledged, but forever cataloged internally as the Poti security breach of 1965. The fisherman's story is a unique footnote in the history of the Cold War, often overshadowed by spy exchanges and missile crises, yet speaks more directly to the human cost of the Iron Curtain than many larger events. It demonstrates that the most effective breaches of the Soviet frontier were often not made by sophisticated espionage, but by the raw, untutored courage of an individual. His legacy is not defined by politics, but by tenacity. He proved that the sea, which the Soviet Navy sought to master and control, could become the ultimate conduit of escape for those who understood its currents and respected its power. The Black Sea, generally seen as a Soviet-dominated zone, became the path to freedom for one determined man. The physical reality of the journey, 10 days, 600 miles, in a tiny, dark, freezing container, battling storms, hunger, and KGB patrols, is a testament to the overwhelming drive for self-determination. Gürüm's initial humiliation by the sailors on the Poti dock, their casual dismissal of his barrel as a joke, was the ultimate security failure, a blind spot of contempt that allowed the impossible to happen. The narrative of Gürüm Rakulishvili, the Georgian fisherman, and his floating barrel will forever be interwoven with the broader tapestry of the Cold War. It is a story of a homemade vessel carrying a priceless cargo, hope. His journey remains an enduring metaphor for the difference between a controlled state and an uncontrolled human spirit. He simply built a better vessel for freedom than the state built for captivity. He sailed from the dark interior of communism into the light of the outside world, powered only by the currents and his own unbroken will. He was, in the end, the ultimate winner of his own private Cold War battle. If you enjoyed this detailed dive into one of the most incredible true escape stories of the Cold War, please like this video, subscribe for more deep dive history narratives, and drop a comment below to share your thoughts on Gürüm's unbelievable journey.